Hello, I'm Robert, and sorry the last video got cut off rather suddenly. This is just because my camera runs out after half an hour, but I said most of what needed to be said anyway. So now I'll move on to the next bit. So in the last video then I looked at Robert Zubrin's meteorite argument and showed how it's not conclusive and that many people think that life on Mars might very well be interestingly different from Earth life. And so now I'm going to look at another one of Robert Zubrin's arguments. It's just quite a good starting point for examining this next stage. So he argues that if life on Mars is interestingly different from Earth life and you return it to Earth, then that means that the life would not be adapted to infect human beings, and so therefore it's quite safe to return it. And again, with this argument, and this is quite an old argument, this goes right back to the 1970s, when Carl Sagan, he was the first to look at this, as far as I know, in the published literature. So he looked at this, and he found that you could argue both ways. First of all, you can argue that if we return life from Mars to Earth, and it's different from Earth life, then, as Robert Zubrin said, that means it's not adapted to infect human beings. But it also means that we have not evolved any resistance to it either. And so you can argue it both ways. And then this has been examined again and again quite a few times. So more recently, Joshua Lederberg, a famous microbiologist, so he looked at this, he came to the same conclusion, that you can argue it both ways. And again, the National Research Council and the European Space Foundation. And then, to understand that a bit more, then if we look at diseases of human beings, then a lot of them come, for instance, from other animals and birds. So, for instance, like bird flu. And as you know, when it comes to a human being from another host, it's often more virulent. And that's because the microorganism, it has to adapt to its host. For most microorganisms, it's not in the interest of the microorganism to kill the host. They want to keep the host healthy so they can continue to grow and thrive in the host. And so the microorganisms, over a period of time, they adapt to be able to keep the host alive for longer and longer. And then the host also evolves defenses against the microorganisms as well. And sometimes that ends up with symbiosis, so they actually come to depend on each other. But however it goes, then the ones that have been infecting human beings for longest are the ones you would expect to be less virulent, and the ones that get to human beings earlier, have just reached human beings the first time, be the most virulent. And then if you think about it, again, that is coming from one animal host to another, eventually to humans. In that chain, there must be a first time when it first went to an animal host. And presumably all our diseases at some point went to an animal host for the first time, the ones that are transmitted in this way through animal hosts. And so then if you think about that, then there must be diseases that hop to human beings for the first time, and we are the very first animal host of that disease. And it seems this is very rare, because there's only one disease that is mentioned in this context, but it's quite a well-known disease, and this is Legionnaires disease. So Legionnaires disease is a disease of amoeba in the soil. So it is a disease of microorganisms that leapt in one step to human beings. So you'd think that's just so far apart. How could a disease of microorganisms become a disease of human beings? But Legionnaires disease shows that you can jump from one to the other in one leap like that. This means that you could have the disease of Martian microorganisms could become a disease of human beings. And then of course there are many habitats on the human body, the sinuses, the lungs, the skin and so on. There are many places potentially for Martian microorganisms to colonize and perhaps cause problems. And so far we've just been talking about diseases of human beings. But in the same way, of course, you could have diseases of animals, and then you could have diseases of crops. Now, I'm going to talk about a whole kind of category of things that could go wrong. And so this might sound quite gloomy, but do remember, I'm saying this, just saying we should look at this carefully and see if these really are problems. On the current level of knowledge of Mars, we simply don't know enough to rule out these possibilities. And exobiologists, when asked about this, have been unable to make proper probability estimates because we don't know enough about Mars, and they can only give their opinions, which is that the chances may be very low, but they can't say for sure. They can't say anything for sure. As we learn more about Mars, we may be able to have a much clearer idea. So I'm just talking about on our present day level of understanding of Mars. And so then the very aim of talking like this is to say, okay, if there is a risk, we should not do it. We should not do this if it turns out that there's a risk that it could cause extinctions or pandemics. So I'm saying this with the very positive aim of saying, look at this clearly, don't look away, look at it and see if it is a risk. And if it is a risk, don't do it. And don't just try to persuade yourself it is okay. We must look at this and see clearly if it is okay. So escalating up, then the next possibility is that you have a disease of crops, of course, and that again could impact human beings quite badly. But you also could have a microorganism from Mars could take over from microorganisms on Earth in an ecosystem and change the way the ecosystem works. And so in various ways you could get disruptions of ecosystems, and you could get mass extinctions as well. So there's just no way of knowing in the worst case, and I haven't yet reached the very worst case. So these all things, it definitely needs care to look at this. Now some people say, okay, but Martian microorganisms, they are adapted surely to Mars. And when they come to Earth, well, they'll only be able to live in very cold places and places that look very like Mars. But then if you think out a little bit more, there are plenty of microorganisms that live in Antarctica that also live here, where I'm living now. And there are even, for instance, there's a microorganism on the human tongue. When a research group, they were looking for microorganisms that were most likely to be able to survive in the very thin Martian atmosphere, so not in a liquid layer, but actually in the atmosphere itself, or just on a rock or something like that, and be able to actually metabolize in those circumstances with very, very dry, very, very low atmospheric pressure. And they were rather astonished to find, they just took all these microorganisms from numerous different locations, and they tried to find the one that was most able to cope with a very thin atmosphere and not just go dormant, but actually was able to metabolize and continue growing with the very thin atmosphere. They didn't duplicate the rest of the Martian conditions, just the very thin atmosphere in this experiment. So it was rather favorable conditions. But they were astonished to find that the one that was able to do this best was a microorganism, at least one of the top candidates that was isolated from a human tongue. And in the human tongue, there's absolutely no need at all to be able to survive in a near vacuum for a microorganism living on the human tongue. They must have just picked this up in the past, but for some reason and microorganisms tend to retain capabilities. And that shows how extremophiles can often end up, and it did better with the Martian atmosphere pressure than it did at Earth normal pressure, this microorganism. So quite astonishing discovery. And so in the same way, a Martian microorganism, it might actually be able to do better on Earth than it did on Mars. With our thicker atmosphere and the warmth, well, microorganisms they used to cold, they very often are able to multiply and do much better in warmer conditions. So there's absolutely no reason at all to suppose that all microorganisms on Mars would be unable to live anywhere on Earth except in very cold, dry conditions. It would just depend on the microorganism and what its other capabilities were. And so that then escalating, but there's an even worse possibility than all of these. Now this is a new one, and I say this is my own idea. So I'm bringing together two things that are completely accepted, but the way I'm bringing together is a kind of synthesis. And I suggest that exobiologists should look at this too. So with each new, when you have a new examination of the risks of returning materials from Mars, then the European Space Foundation, when they did their assessment, then it was just after the discovery of extraordinary capabilities of microorganisms to exchange DNA using gene transfer agents, which are tiny, tiny fragments of DNA. It wasn't known before then quite how easy this could happen. And as a result, they made a careful look at whether it's necessary to contain gene transfer agents inside a Mars sample container, and they came to the conclusion that it was quite important to do so. So you do get these changes due to development of scientific understanding. So a new thing that has happened since these reports is the study of XNA. And XNA is xenonucleic acid, and it was known long before, but a very extensive study recently of synthesis of life and XNA. So XNA, it's like DNA, but it's got a different backbone. And there's a whole alphabetical soup of it, so there's TNA, PNA, HNA, there's a whole lot of different versions which have different things along the backbone, the same bases as DNA, but with a different backbone. And so these would function just like DNA. And a rather remarkable recent development is that they found ways to integrate these XNA into ordinary DNA-based cells, so that you can translate DNA into XNA, and you can translate XNA back to DNA using cell machinery, and you can also actually get XNA to start being able to use some of the cell machinery for itself. And so they are reasonably optimistic that you might be able to create a microorganism that has XNA as its basis instead of DNA, substitute XNA for DNA. And in these experiments they are proceeding with extreme caution, because what if this XNA then gets out of the laboratory and this microorganism starts reproducing in the wild, and either starts taking over Earth-based microorganisms or just out-competing them. So they have all the ingredients to make this actually happen. It's coming together. It's going to be a difficult thing to do, but they would also be very cautious about doing this to make sure that the XNA, that it uses some elements and ingredients that can't be synthesized directly in the normal environment on Earth. And it's really it potentially needs extreme care, because at one point during this process of turning it from a DNA-based to XNA-based life, you would have both of them coexisting in the same cell, and that's when it would be at its most dangerous. And you want to be absolutely sure that that could not get escaped. And I think they aren't doing this yet. It's just too dangerous to do at this stage. And when they work out what as well as being technically difficult, but they are looking at this theoretically, under what conditions would it be possible to do that? And one paper I looked at examining this, and they came up with a probability of 1 chance in 10 to the power 20 as being a possible probability that you could aim for of anything going wrong. You want to be, and that's a tiny, tiny probability, you want to be absolutely certain that this XNA couldn't possibly escape into the wild. So the reason they're concerned about that is surely because the XNA could take over from DNA, or the XNA-based life could take over from DNA-based life. Now, I'm bringing that together with ideas about Martian XNA. So there's been a thread for a long time that Martian life does not need to be based on DNA. The most interesting case is where it has evolved independently on Mars. And in that case, there seems no reason why it should look exactly the same as DNA. So then you're talking about something like XNA, very much like what these people are looking at in their laboratories. So you're talking about it possibly returning to Earth in the most interesting case, some form of life that is not based on DNA. And that's the reason why they did, for instance, the Viking labelled release experiment, was specifically to look for life that is not based on DNA. They were thinking this will look for any form of life, no matter what its basis. And this has also been why they look for biosignatures and not just for DNA on Mars, because of the possibility that it could be some other form of life not based on DNA. So I think this is something that should be examined carefully. What is the risk of Martian XNA, which is the most interesting case? So the exobiologists would be absolutely over their moon, and it would be the most interesting thing if we could possibly find XNA on Mars. But the question is it then safe to return it to Earth? And however intriguing, how much you would love to have it in your laboratory, I think you need to look very, very closely at that and see, is it wise to do that if we ever do discover XNA on Mars? Or should we continue to just study it on Mars and find out more and more and more about it? And maybe even to the point where we think about sequencing it on Earth. So you could sequence the XNA in very careful conditions without having to return a sample from Mars to Earth, but just look at it on Mars, sequence it on Mars. This is well within current technology to start doing stuff like that, first with DNA and then later with XNA once we know what it's like. And then, only then, once you're very sure what it is you're returning, to think about possibly returning it to Earth. So I'm just saying, I'm not an exobiologist, I'm not competent to study this. I'm suggesting exobiologists should look very carefully at this and say, could Martian XNA be as potentially dangerous as synthetic XNA that might be made in laboratories on the Earth? It's not clear that it would be, because the synthetic XNA could be using bases and things that just wouldn't be available to early life when it evolves. So, it's something to research, but it seems, at least possible that certainly these PNA and TNA, they've been suggested as being possible precursors for life. So it seems at least quite possible that they could evolve on Mars. And so anyway, that's it. And so next I'm going to start looking at the ideas for returning a sample from Mars and sample containment, and also about ideas for studying the sample without returning it to Earth, and whether you could return it somewhere else or whether you could study it in situ on Mars. And so I hope I haven't run out this time. Hopefully it's the end of this video. I'll go and look at that in the next one. And do remember, this is all very positive. I'm sure this is not going to happen. That surely human beings are sensible enough, and there would have to be extensive public debate before anyone does anything, like for legal reasons as well, that it's not legally possible to go to Mars and to either colonize Mars or return a sample to Earth without having very extensive public debate and international treaties and so forth updated before this can happen. I think I'll look at the legal situation next, and then I'll look at the containment.